Is China seriously considering providing legal aid to Russia? And what would that mean for the war? And is Ukraine getting ready to launch its own offensive? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's February 25th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first we'll take a look at the control map. You can see there's two sort of significant changes. One is in this Russian effort to encircle Avdiivka. You can see they've advanced through this open field here and set up shop outside Krasnohorivka and Vasily. As we can see, there's still really two main ways into or out of Avdiivka. And it's fair to say that they're not in any imminent danger of being cut off. But you can see that this is, again, advance, possibly in preparation of taking this Krasnohorivka and this Vesely. But we just don't see, even by Russian standards, very much movement in this front generally. When we look north to Bakhmut, you guys can see there are some small changes, probably just the front lines tightening up, troops repositioning into improved defensive positions. You can see, interestingly, Russian forces seem to have pushed into these two small tree lines by this river here. Kind of an unusual spot to see an advance, especially given that it's a huge salient outside of Russian lines. But you can see this is all no man's land, so the chances that it's actually occupied by Ukrainian troops it is kind of limited, right? You can sit there and be 500 or 1,000 meters away, right, and get field of fire. It doesn't mean that like the troops are sitting, feet away from each other along this exact line, especially when it comes to open terrain like this. As you can see, no significant changes to the actual town of Bakhmut itself. But when we look at the combat map, you can see things are kind of interesting simply because the volume of attacks and effort is limited. You can see that there's just the 3 attacks south of Avdiivka and just 2 efforts outside of Bakhmut, which says to me that Russia probably did push pretty hard during the 1-year anniversary of the war, really hoping to achieve some symbolic gains. But now they need to probably slow their efforts and refit. What's fascinating is that Russia said literally nothing, no comments at all on the 1-year anniversary, likely because they failed to achieve any of their stated objectives and really don't have any major territorial gains to show since July. Again, I think an appropriate level of spin could absolutely give them. You could spin the past couple weeks of advances. I mean, you guys can see, right? A month ago, Soledar was in Ukrainian hands, right? And while not necessarily itself a huge deal, you can see this sort of creeping advance with the right level of like spin and reframing. The Russian propaganda machine could probably finagle this into some sort of like, oh yeah, we're totally about to win, guys. We got it. Like, if not a total victory, then to just roll out stats like we've taken X kilometers of Ukrainian territory and 6 villages are now, if there's one thing we know, it's that you can spin propaganda in any way that you want. Every media outlet's great on it, right? Turning a non-story into a major story, turning a serious issue and trivializing it depending on, what narrative you want to spin. So Russia just as good at it as anyone. So I'm surprised they actually didn't say anything about this conflict or about the 1-year anniversary and touting at least the limited gains that they've made. Again, though, I guess in the grand scheme of things, they don't even want to call attention to it because, at the high water mark in like March, you can see just how deep into Ukrainian territory Russia had gone. All the green represents advances that Russian forces made. And you can see just how close they came to Kiev. And when we back it out, you can see, right, that they had big chunks of Kharkiv, Kherson. So it's been characterized primarily by Russian withdrawals, no doubt about it. And maybe they just don't want to even draw attention to the fact that a year ago you were talking about taking Kiev, and now you're touting the fact that you've seized a salt mine with some surrounding houses. So one possible theory. But here's the thing. Let's talk about the Chinese increasing amount of Chinese rhetoric around this conflict. This is actually worrying, right? And Russia released a 12-point peace plan. If you've read this, it is incredibly neutral. It is incredibly milquetoast and open to interpretation, respecting countries' sovereignty, ceasing hostilities, resuming peace talks. This is like a plan to make a plan. Reduce strategic risks, usually a term for nuclear weapons, and cease unilateral sanctions. This is really, really milquetoast stuff, and like this is like a celebrity weighing in on. This is like an NBA player weighing in on the Chinese human rights violation, right? Where the best you can do is to say something so generic that no one could possibly be offended or even really believe you're talking about any specific instance. So it's just like, what do you think about the Uyghurs? And the NBA players are always like, oh, human rights are an important part of the international order. And you're like, what does that mean? They're like, human rights are an important part of it, right? It means nothing. So this is classic bureaucratic non-speak. But what's most interesting is that it signals that China is at least involved and watching this situation unfold. And they're trying, they speculate that they're trying to find a balance between supporting Russia and retaining access to European markets by portraying China as a somewhat disinterested third-party mediator. This isn't really a peace plan, and it's not even really a blueprint for a settlement. But U.S. intelligence is assessing that China may be seriously considering sending weapons to Russia amidst continued pressure from Russian sanctions on Russia's defense industrial base. And we know that Russia has manpower. What it lacks is equipment and training, but mostly equipment. And that Chinese officials have not made a final decision on lethal aid, but are discussing the price and scope to supply attack drones and ammunition to Russian officials. Senior U.S. officials reportedly assessed that recent intel suggests that China is leaning towards providing the equipment to Russia based on a bilateral arms sale agreement, not a security assistance. So that means that, Russia is going to expect cash on delivery. Russian officials are supposedly engaged with Chinese drone manufacturer for the production of 100 ZT-180 drones for Russian forces by April, which can carry up to a 50-kilogram warhead. So, that's a serious munition. Now, this is worrying, not necessarily because 100 drones is going to change the course of the battlefield, but what's worrying is that it could establish a precedent in which China becomes a supplier of the Russian armed forces. And this is very troubling because China's ability to manufacture and their ability to manufacture weapons in-house is tremendous. They have a large defense industrial base that could easily equip Russian forces. And so it's really, really would become a potential massive escalation in the war and make Russia massively more effective on the battlefield if they could access, even if it's not necessarily fully modern equipment, even if it's a generation or two old, just adequate equipment, full stop, would make a massive difference. Now, of course, there's what can Russia pay for? And the answer is probably actually a fair amount, right? China does need Russian oil. They have been purchasing it. And but China has to realize that doing so may risk closing European and American markets. This is tough because China's economy has been battered by COVID, and with their reopening, they want to be able to bolster their economy by exporting manufactured goods, not to Russia, right? 100 drones at a time cannot sustain the economy, but access to the U.S. market for manufactured goods can absolutely sustain the Chinese economy. So China has to thread some needles, and ultimately, there's one thing we can be certain of. It's that China's government looks out for China's interests first, as all governments sort of do, but China is more explicit. And so ultimately, if dealing with the United States and Europe is long-term in China's best interest, they're probably not going to continue to align themselves with Russia. But they have to believe that there are real consequences, right? That if they think that Europe and the US are going to not close their markets because they don't want to damage their markets relative to China, then China knows that it can play a lot harder and play a lot closer to Russia if, sort of daring America and Europe to close their markets with China. And I say close, they won't close it. That would be an exaggeration. But I mean, institute sanctions that would prohibit or make extremely difficult for China to get its goods into these markets. So very, very, very potentially, but maybe a nothing burger, but maybe a portend of something very, very escalatory in the war. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you for today. Thank you guys, as always. If you are on the Patreon, you know that we just dropped a Patreon video yesterday. I haven't updated this list. I know there's a bunch of new people in the colonel tier and in the lieutenant tier, and I thank all of you. Tomorrow I'm going to have this updated. But if you want to support the channel, check out the Patreon below. And until next time, I'll see you guys later.